So here's a question that we are all interested in. We are publishing very many papers on the topic of why we are moral. So in this talk, I'm not going to be too picky about labels. So it's fine if we call the behavior that we try to explain cooperative or altruistic or pro-social. What we are trying to explain is all deviations that humans have from simple selfishness. The details do matter, but for now, the label, I'm not going to be very picky about. Now, if trying to explain why we are moral or cooperative or altruistic is done with the prisoner's dilemma. So the prisoner's dilemma, we all know, it's totally understandable that this would be the way that we model cooperation, right? It has individual interests that don't align with our collective interests, and that's exactly what we need to understand cooperation. Now, if that is your model, if that's the puzzle you want to solve, why do we cooperate in prisoner's dilemmas, then it's not strange that the mechanisms that we explore fall into three broad categories. So the first is population structure, and that can be group structure. There can be stylized structures like the cycle, or it can be a structure like a network. And what all of these structures have in common is that they are deviations from a well-mixed population. If there's local dispersal, then being close to someone means that you are more likely to share genes with your neighbor than you are with a random individual in the population, and that makes stuff happen. So as soon as being close means that you are somewhat more likely to be identical by descent, then we can also look at population structure models as inducing kin selection. Now, there's also something that most of us are familiar with. There's Hamilton's rule. You can use that. It's partly controversial exactly how general Hamilton's rule is, but at least for a large set of models of population structure, you can think of the right criterion to check whether or not a cooperative trait will evolve as Hamilton's rule. Now, just a detail about population structure is that sometimes Hamilton's rule makes us think that as soon as there is positive relatedness between those that interact, then you can get evolution of cooperation or evolution of altruism. And since the 90s, we know that that's actually not true. The thing that makes cooperation evolve, or that makes altruism evolve, is that you need a discrepancy between how related those that have the opportunity to cooperate are and those that you're competing with. So if the relatedness in both of these categories is the same, then you actually get what is called the cancellation effect. So it's a little harder than just getting positive relatedness between those that interact. Okay, this is a detail. I just wanted to share that because it's not always included in descriptions of how population structure works. So that's one large category of explanation of papers. So I would classify that as one mechanism. Now, another mechanism is repetition. There's also a million papers on that, a lot of them in economics, but also in biology. And a somewhat smaller category is partner choice. And what you regularly see nowadays is that these three are described as different pathways to assortment, and assortment is really the key to the evolution of cooperation. Now, at the very end of this talk, I'm going to try to come back to this and see if we can get a few details about this a little differently. But this is more or less a summary of a large part of the literature. Now, the paper that I'm presenting today, what it tries to do is look at the enormous theory literature on the evolution of cooperation and morality and altruism, and contrast it with the also large empirical literature. And the question is, how well do we do in the theory domain in explaining the thing that all of this theory is meant to explain? So there's two things on which to focus. And the first is the behavior that we see in our empirical papers. Does that match the behavior that you would expect to evolve in those models? And I hope that I have enough time to present a few cases where that's, a few instances where that's really not the case. So that's one of the two dimensions that we're going to look at. And a co-author of mine, Sarah Matthew, I learned from her that there's also something else that you should look at if you want to evaluate whether or not your explanation is a good explanation. And that is, you should ask yourself, not only are the things that are explaining cooperation present in us, but you should also ask whether they're absent in others, right? So if we explain morality or altruism or cooperation by repetition, and we see that we have repetition and cooperation, but a bunch of other species also have repetition but no cooperation, then that's not as good an explanation as you would think if you're only looking at humans. So one thing that in this context I'm going to focus on a little bit is also that we might ask ourselves if it's a coincidence that morality, or the specifically human deviations from simple selfishness, that they evolved in us, and we're also a species that has delayed gratification, mental time travel, and theory of mind. And I'm going to argue that this is not a coincidence, but you would miss all of that if you look at the wrong game theory. So this example that I'm going to present now is there for two purposes. So the first is so let me first explain what this is. So this is a part of theory that I'm super proud of. So this is, I think of this as a unified theory of repetition and population structure, where on the horizontal axis there is repetition, and on the vertical axis there is population structure, or a parameter that parameterizes that. And it's a beautiful theory. It has unrestricted strategy space. It has Hamilton's rule on the vertical axis. It has the folk theorem, that's a result from economics about repetition, on the horizontal axis, and it has everything in the middle. So I'm super proud of this. And at the end of the paper, what we say is that a possible recipe for human cooperation may have been a combination of a lot of repetition and a little bit of population structure. And what I was thinking of at the time, or we were thinking of at the time, is that humans are here, they are just over this white line, and that means a bunch of things. Now, unfortunately, we are not the only species here. There's a bunch of other primates that have similarly much repetition and similar population structures. And my dream, of course, would be that you could go, oh, this is where elephants are, and this is where ants are, and but this picture turns out to be quite useless as an explanation of why different species don't have the same level of cooperation. So so there's two reasons why I would want to share this. One is that that this is an illustration of the approach that we think that we're all playing the same games. All species are playing the same games. It's just that we think that they differ in how much repetition there is, or they differ in what kind of population structure they're living in. And later, I'm going to, or quite soon, I'm going to argue that that's not the right approach if you want to explain cooperation in humans. So that's one reason why I want to put this up. And the other reason why I want to put this up, so as Sergei said, I'm not afraid to disagree with people. So I've made a lot of, unfortunately, a lot of enemies, but I'm committed to the scientific method. So that happens. But I also want to put this up to say that I'm not only throwing shade on other people's work, but also on my own work, because I love this paper, I love this result, and it turns out to be pretty useless for the explanation of human cooperation. So what we're arguing is that it's not that we have a different population structure or a different repetition rate, but we're playing different games. And that's because our niche is that we are a technological social species. That means we have to invest. Technology means that you make tools for future use, and many of the things we do together. So with that angle, it is going to be unsurprising that theory of mind and delayed gratification and mental time travel, right? So we remember things from the past and we can imagine things happening in the future. All of that would evolve together with morality. And that's because those things are neat. So all of these things would evolve if you play games where there's a time component where you can think ahead of what happens in the future. And these things are needed for commitment to make sense. And commitment, it's a feedback loop where all of these things evolve together. So let's dwell a little bit on what commitment is. And I'm going to, well, first of all, I should say, of course, that it's not my idea, it's not our idea to think of commitment. There's a fantastic book from Robert Frank, Passions Within Reason. It's a book from 1988. It has been around all this time. So all this time that this large literature on the evolution of cooperation has been developing, this idea was there. I loved the book when I read it, and for some reason I still kept doing prisoner's dilemmas. Of course, this book hasn't gone unnoticed, but commitment as a mechanism for the evolution of cooperation nonetheless is typically absent in overviews of what could make cooperation evolve or altruism evolve. And it's also largely absent in empirical papers that test or that describe things and with an evolutionary angle. Okay, so here's an example. The Ultimatum Game is a game that many of us know. Others maybe don't know, so let's look at this for a second. So the first mover is the proposer. The proposer gets €4. So this is a simple version of the Ultimatum Game. And the proposer can do one of 5 proposals, a proposal where all €4 go to the proposer, 3 for the proposer, 1 for the responder, 2 each, 1 for the proposer, 3 for the responder, or all 4 to the responder. Now the second mover is the responder, and the responder needs to have an answer ready for all 5 proposals, and that answer could be yes or no. If it's a yes, then the proposal gets implemented. If it's a no, then the money disappears and both of them get nothing. Now, there's a bunch of Nash equilibria, and let's first check if this is a Nash equilibrium. So a Nash equilibrium is a combination of behaviors where neither of the two has a reason to deviate. Well, that's true for the proposer, because if the proposer proposes the equal split here, then it gets accepted. If the proposer would propose more for herself than the equal split, then that would be rejected, then she ends up with nothing. If she would propose less for herself, those would also be accepted, but then she has less than 2. So the proposer has no reason to deviate, given that this is what the responder does. And the responder also has no reason to deviate, given that this is the proposal of the proposer, because the most important thing is that she would have to accept this. If she doesn't, then she leaves money on the table, and the other proposals are not made, so yes or no is fine, either option is fine. So this is indeed a combination of strategies where neither has a reason to deviate. Now, the next question we can ask is, how stable is this equilibrium? And for that, it's good to focus on this part. So what if we assume that everyone makes a mistake every once in a while? So the proposer sometimes fails to make this proposal, but makes another proposal like this one or this one. Now, in case the proposer does that, then a responder that would say no to this proposal leaves money on the table, leaves €1 on the table. And therefore, if there would be a mutant responder that also says yes to this proposal, then that would actually be beneficial. And therefore, you could imagine that with a little bit of noise, that this no erodes and changes into most responders saying yes. Now, once most responders say yes, it becomes in the proposer's best interest to propose this. And now we are at a new Nash equilibrium where neither of the two would want to deviate, but this Nash equilibrium is less good for the responder and better for the proposer. So the idea is that if you have a little bit of noise, then every time the responder would end up accepting every proposal in which she gets a positive amount. So the last thing here, of course, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you reject getting nothing or accept getting nothing. Now, here is what commitment can do. So we're looking again at this part of the game. So what if individuals can commit to rejecting? And what if proposers can tell? So what if I would reject this proposal, and the proposers can tell the difference between me, who rejects it, and someone else who accepts it. So then it would be in the interest of the proposer to do me this proposal, whereas other people that wouldn't be committed to rejecting would still get the old proposal. So if that works, then it's of course still costly to reject this proposal if it is made. So that's bad about being committed to rejecting, but it also works to your advantage in the sense that it changes the behavior of the proposer, because now you get a better proposal in case the proposer recognizes it. So of course it's crucial here that there's this information is shared and the proposer can tell. So that's what we call rationally irrational. So it's irrational to reject a proposal and leave money on the table, but it's also rational to be committed to it. So the behavior itself is bad for fitness, but being committed to the behavior is good for your fitness. So now maybe I would suggest to now go back to the existing literature with the models of the evolution of cooperation and see how that literature deals with the behavior that we find in experiments with the Ultimatum game, in which we do see that responders do reject a whole bunch of proposals that they think are unfair. So what we try to do is walk the path as best as we can from models in the literature to the behavior in this game. So there's a bunch of, there's a supply of models in the literature, and there's a bunch of empirical papers. So we walk a whole bunch of paths, and I want to walk one path with you. So what if we go for a model where the game that we play is a prisoner's dilemma, and we look at a mechanism in the set of models that looks at population structure. Now, for the pro-social preferences, we take Fair-Schmidt inequity-averse preferences. Those are, especially in the econ literature, commonplace. This is the standard deviation from simple selfishness that we consider, where if you're ahead, you're willing to give up something to benefit the other one, but if you're behind, you're willing to give up fitness to hurt the other one. Those you can then apply to the Ultimatum game. Now, at both of these arrows, there are problems. The first is that if you have a model with prisoner's dilemmas and population structure, then you can get altruism if there's positive relatedness and the cancellation effect doesn't happen. You can get spite if there's negative relatedness. But what you can't get is altruism when you're ahead and spite when you're behind. So that just doesn't follow from those models. So there's an issue here at this first arrow. Now there's also an issue at this second arrow, and that is that inequity-averse preferences can explain behavior in the Ultimatum game. So it can explain why people reject unfair offers. But what it can't do is explain the fact that we don't, that how the proposal came to be matters for whether or not we reject it. So there's a famous experiment by Sally Blount, I think you pronounce it, where the proposal is generated by a computer, and then people reject way less. And if inequity-averse preferences explain the behavior, that shouldn't happen. So that path between theory and behavior has two problems. Now in the paper, we look at a whole bunch of other things. We're not doing that here, but if we have time at the end, we can go deeper into it. So there, you can think of selection for efficient norms. That doesn't work here. You can think of repetition, also doesn't work here. So there's a whole bunch of things that don't work here. Now, one thing that I mentioned is that what needs to happen is that the proposers understand the difference between those that are committed to rejecting and those that aren't. So just wanted to also include a fun experiment here. That's one where we had people in the lab play a simple version of the Ultimatum game. And then later in a different lab, we would show pictures of two individuals. So the pictures are taken before the whole experiment starts. And both of them have gotten the same proposal and one of them accepted and one rejected. And then in the second lab, we pay people for how well they pick the one that rejects. So, maybe because it's fun, maybe you can try to see which one of those two rejected an unfair proposal. So, I can't tell here, but usually people in the audience kind of get it right. And there's also a version where before the experiment starts, we ask people to express a range of emotions, and one of them is anger. And these two first, they have a neutral face for a bunch of time, and this is their angry faces. And then again, we ask people in the second lab to pick who out of these two rejected the same unfair proposal. And most people get it right here as well. So in the experiment, we find that in some treatments, people do pretty okay. It's not driven by a few individuals that are easy to recognize. It's not driven by a few individuals that are super good at predicting who has the easiest to trigger angry button. People are also not fantastic at this. It's relatively, they do a little bit better than chance. But for this mechanism to work, you don't have to have more than better than chance. And this is a minimal setup where it's just the face. Of course, we know from a bunch of other experiments that if people can talk to each other, if they can make promises, then things are getting a bit more spectacular. Now, here's another game, because it's fun. It's also a famous game. It's a trust game. Again, there's two people. The first is the truster, and the truster has €3 and can decide to just park the €3 and keep them, or the truster can choose to send the €3 over to the trustee, and then they turn into €6, and then the trustee can choose to keep all the €6, send €2 back, send €4 back, or send all €6 back. Now, also here, you can ask yourself, what would be a stable Nash equilibrium? Now, the trustee here, there would always be selection to not to send back less and less, because as long as you keep sending back stuff or money, it's always better to send back nothing or send back less. So there would be selection for the trustee to not send back anything. And given that the truster knows that the trustee is not going to send back anything, it's in the best interest of the truster to just hold on to the €3. Now, also here, commitment could change this. So if there's a trustee that can't help but sending €4 back, and if the truster can tell, then this trustee would, of course, hurt herself by sending back 4 and not keeping everything. But it would also be to the advantage of the trustee, because then the truster would actually send back money over. They would send money over. Now, again, here it's important that the truster can tell, as before, because of course, it doesn't help you to be committed if the other player doesn't understand that you're committed. Then your commitment can't change the behavior of the truster. So here's the same. It's rationally irrational. It's irrational to send back money, but it's rational to be committed to sending back money. And again, the behavior itself is bad for your fitness, and being committed to it is good. What is different between the trust game and the ultimatum game is that in both of these games, well, let's first say what is the same. So in both of these games, if you have a partner that you play this game with, then being committed can change the behavior of your existing partner. Now, what is different is you don't have a partner and there's partner choice, then being a trustee that sends back money also helps you being chosen as a partner, right? If this wouldn't be the trust game, but the who to trust game, and the truster can choose between a selfish individual that's not going to send back anything and someone who's committed to sending back money, then that helps you being chosen for as a trustee. Now that's different in the ultimatum game. Of course, if you are committed to turning down proposals, unfair proposals, then the first mover would not choose you. So in this game, partner choice would be a second pathway through which commitment can help you, can work to your advantage, can help you change the behavior of other individuals to your advantage. So in economics, this is called, so in economics, it's called backward induction. If you assume that the first mover knows what the second mover is going to do and has her behavior depend on that. So the purpose of commitment is to change the behavior of the first mover, and in game theory terms, that would be that you want to change the course of backward induction. And for that, you need, of course, that the other player knows what it is like to be you and can imagine that some people have different preferences than others. And that is all part of theory of mind. So for this to work at all, you definitely need to have theory of mind. Now let's maybe go back to prisoner's dilemmas and ask ourselves if our behavior in prisoner's dilemmas matches with what the theory would predict. Sorry. And so let's for a second focus on models with population structure. Now, there's a bunch of models where the transmission is genetic. There's a bunch of models where the transmission is assumed to be cultural, and there's a bunch of models that leave that up to whoever wants to use the model. Now, with genetic transmission, in 90% of the papers on the evolution of cooperation in humans, the introduction says something like, it's a mystery that we're also nice to genetically unrelated others. And that makes perfect sense because in population structure models, you would expect kin selection to happen. And therefore, if we look at Hamilton's rule, we would expect altruistic behavior only to happen between those that are related, not between those that are not related. So, that's something that is almost in every paper. Now, something a little similar, or at least the conclusion is a little similar, happens when transmission is cultural. And I would like to illustrate that with an example. So suppose we have this stylized population structure where everybody has two neighbors and is organized on a cycle. So here, let's say that the red players play defect, the blue players play cooperate, and they play a prisoner's dilemma with their left neighbor and their right neighbor. So these guys have their defectors themselves. They have defectors on the left and on the right. So they get 0 from their left neighbor and 0 from their right neighbor. And therefore they have a total of 0 for payoffs. Now these guys are on the boundaries. They're defectors themselves. They have a cooperator on the left or on the right and a defector on the left. So they get 0 from one side, 3 from the other side, and that adds up to 3. Here's the cooperators that get -1 from one side and +2 from the other. There they get 1. And then there is a bunch of cooperators that have cooperators left and right, and therefore they get 2 + 2 is 4. So if you have payoff biased imitation, then suppose this individual gets to update, is chosen to update the strategy, then you could imagine that this person looks to the left and looks to the right, and maybe it looks even a bit more to the left and a bit more to the right. But in all of those, or maybe even to her own payoff, but in all of those instances, especially in all of the instances where cooperation evolves, it is the case that those payoffs being higher than those payoffs makes these individuals switch from defection to cooperation. Now, if this person switches, then of course, instead of going up, the fitness actually, or the payoffs go down. So that's a bummer. And if the person that has this update chance would have thought in terms of counterfactuals, this person would have understood that changing from defection to cooperation would lower his or her own payoff. So for this to work, individuals would have to not really understand the game, right? If they would understand the game, they would understand what the counterfactual is, and they wouldn't switch. But if they don't understand the game, there is space for them to go, well, I don't know how it works, but these guys that are playing corporate seem to be doing something right because they're getting high payoffs. So for this to work, what you need is a limited understanding of games, and that's actually something that we're really good at. So we're really good at understanding incentives, and it's also the case that if we have humans in the lab and we find them to cooperate in a prisoner's dilemma, then it's not the case that they really would like to get high payoffs, but they don't know how to get the high payoffs. They're typically fully aware that by cooperating, they lower their own payoff and they increase the payoff of other people in the lab. So it's not by lack of understanding the consequences of their actions that they cooperate. It's not that they're really selfish, but they just don't know how to make money. So that means that both for genetic transmission and for cultural transmission, there are reasons to see a mismatch between the behavior that we see, which is we're also nice to genetically unrelated others, and we fully understand that when we cooperate, that we are paying for that and that others benefit. So on both of these modes of transmission, there's reasons to see a mismatch between the behavior that would evolve in those models and the behavior that we see that people do. Here it's not really a smooth transition, but here's another game that we thought of. We don't know what to call it, the insurance game or the friendship game. So here's how it works. There's two individuals, and one of them is going to be lucky and the other one's going to be unlucky. So in one scenario, the yellow player is lucky and gets €3, and the other player gets nothing. In the other scenario, the blue player is lucky, gets €3, and the yellow player gets nothing. Now the lucky player gets to choose whether to keep everything or to share. And if the yellow player shares, then both of them get €2. So here you can imagine that how much extra money or extra calories or extra whatever adds to your fitness might depend on how much you have already. And if you have a lot, then a little bit extra doesn't help you as much as it does when you have a little. And there you could imagine that sharing is going to help the other person more than it hurts you. Now, if the blue player is the lucky one, then the blue player also can choose between keeping and sharing. Now here, if you do normal backward induction without the possibility of commitment, then of course it would be in the best interest of the lucky player to not share and just keep everything. But what if you could commit to sharing? So if you could commit to sharing, in this case, you would have to depend on partner choice, but that could make you an attractive partner. And if individuals could seek each other out, if they are committed to sharing as well, then those pairs of people would now guarantee themselves €2, because whoever is the lucky one is going to share. Whereas those individuals that don't commit themselves are going to be paired with others that also are not committed, and they get some, €3 half the time, but €0 the other half of the times. Now, this is a super simple game, but the reason why we thought of this is that there's a whole bunch of behaviors that are more consistent with commitment evolving in a game like this. And that's why we call it the friendship game, because that's what friends do, right? Friends check, our friendship is an important part of friendship is that you care for each other, right? So we also thought that hypothetical reciprocity is a thing, right? So reciprocity, we all know, you scratch my back, I scratch yours. We see it in the lab. If people are nice to us, we're nice to them, or nicer to them. But what you also hear a lot is people say, I did it for you because you would have done the same for me. And this is typically said in large events for which it's super unlikely that this will ever happen. If you give me a kidney, there's not going to be a moment in which I have the opportunity to give you a kidney. But stuff that people sometimes say here is, I'm doing it because you would have done the same for me. So there's a bunch of things about human morality and human behavior, like friendships, that suggest that we seek that we are becoming more attractive as friends or as partners by committing to sharing, and that we seek each other out. And that's how commitment can evolve in games like this. And that is also, we think, in line with behavior that we observe. We're still thinking about, designing a good experiment in good econ tradition where we don't deceive our subjects, where we can find this hypothetical reciprocity. Now, the last thing that I would like to cover is punishment. So sometimes the question is why, or the question is, why is there costly cooperation? And one answer to that would be, well, it's not really that costly if there's also punishment looming. If there's punishment looming, then of course you'd better cooperate to avoid punishment. But then the new question is, why would there be costly punishment? So the idea then is there's cooperation, there is punishment, and punishment can stabilize cooperation. And then you could have punishment of the non-punisher, so second order punishment, and that could stabilize punishment. And one idea here is that cooperation is costly, but punishment is costly too, but less so, right? Because you don't have to punish too much if everybody cooperates. So this is something that happens a lot in the literature. So here you could imagine that, for instance, group selection might have a hard time sustaining cooperation without punishment, but it's getting easier if you would to sustain cooperation with punishment. Now, what I would like to suggest is that if we look in terms of commitment, then that can be fruitful in order, explaining also punishment. So punishment is a game changer, right? So if you change the game from a prisoner's dilemma without punishment to a prisoner's dilemma with punishment, that's really different. So the standard way of looking at this is to say, well, cooperation is costly. It's always better to defect than to cooperate, whatever the other one's doing. And so is punishment. It's always better for you to not punish. And therefore, this is as much of a mystery as this, unless you think in terms of group selection, and this being less costly than this if everybody or almost everybody cooperates. Now, what we would say is that punishment of course, punishment itself is costly, but being committed to punishment may change the behavior in the first round of your partner, and therefore that costs. You may not have to invoke group selection. You could just be individual selection, where those that punish, that would punish defection, receive cooperation, and those that wouldn't receive defection. And the labels in the literature are actually not neutral to the explanation. So in the literature, what typically happens is that punishment in cases like this is called altruistic punishment, because the idea of the altruism here is that if I punish someone today, then I teach this person a lesson, and the next person that meets the one that I just punished is going to benefit from the improvement in behavior. And that's why it's called altruistic. But if the evolutionary reason why we punish is not to help the next person, but to deter my partner from defecting on me today, then it's really not altruistic. And one element that has contributed to why we think of this as altruistic punishment is that in most of our lab experiments, we don't know what people did in previous interactions. And that implies that you can't find out who is and who is not committed to punishment. And therefore, the pathway for these benefits for yourself to being committed is blocked in most of our experiments. And therefore, in our experiments, the only possible benefit that you could observe is a change in behavior in future interactions. But that may not be the reason why we punish. The reason why we punish might be to deter people from being bad to us. So there is a whole bunch of results that make a whole lot more sense when you think in terms of commitment than when you don't. And one of them is, for instance, a great paper about parochial altruism, or in this case, it's actually better described maybe as parochial punishment. So here, there's 3 players. Player A is a dictator and can divide a bunch of money between player A and player B. And then player C is going to has the opportunity to punish player A for his or her behavior. And this paper starts out with asking the question, if punishing behavior has evolved to uphold norms within the group of punishment. And in that case, you would expect that punishment happens when the person that you punish is part of your own group, because that's the one who needs to be taught a lesson. So definitely, if everyone is a member of the same group, then punishment should happen if someone is not generous as a dictator. But maybe also if the one that you want to teach a lesson is part of the same group. But it turns out that what really drives punishing behavior is that the one on the receiving end of the dictator game is the same group as the punisher. So, and that makes perfect sense if we are, that doesn't make sense if this is about teaching people about their future interaction, but it does make sense if you think of this as people being committed to punish people that behave badly towards others of your own tribe. Of course, that would still require an explanation, but it is consistent with this observation. Now, another observation that is interesting. So there's a paper that maybe a bunch of you know. It's called Winners Don't Punish. It sets out to answer a whole different question. There can be a debate about whether or not this is a good way to answer that question. But if we set that aside, there is something interesting that happens. So what happens there is that there's a repeated game. It's a repeated prisoner's dilemma. But there's an extra option. And this extra option is to punish. Now, the difference between defection and punish is that defection is bad for your opponent, but it's not costly to you. Now, punishment is a bit worse for your opponent, but it does cost you. Now, what is surprising is that there is a bunch of people that use this punishment option that they don't need, right? You don't need this to discipline your opponent, but apparently there are a whole bunch of people that are willing to pay extra money to hurt the other one extra bad. It's not in their own interest, as the data indicate, because they end up with lower payoffs, but people do it, right? And it's not needed to deter people from defection, because punishing with defection does that trick already. So normally what happens a lot is that people suggest that our behavior in one-shot games is sometimes caused by a misfiring from behavior that we learned from repeated games. But I would say that here actually is, what you see here is the opposite happening. So people use this punishment in repeated versions of this game where they really shouldn't, and they pay for it, right? They lose payoffs over it, and that can be explained by people being really committed to teach the other one a lesson. Now, the last thing to say, something else that maybe thinking in terms of commitment may help understanding. So there's also a famous paper about spontaneous giving and calculated greed, where if people have to move fast, they are more generous than if they have more time to reflect. And this paper is followed by a theory paper that says, well, here's what's going on here. If you don't know if you're playing a repeated game or a one-shot game, then you should have an intuitive system that's nice and a reflective system that is not so nice. Now, we also wrote a paper saying that actually you can't draw that conclusion. But what I would also say is a better explanation of what we find here is perhaps that that anything that you commit to can erode if you expose it to sufficiently much reflection. So in the original experiment, that doesn't replicate, by the way, but in the original experiment, the choices are between doing something nice and doing nothing, or doing something neutral. And the spontaneous thing to do is something nice that is costly, cooperate. And if you reflect, you might stop doing that. But also, if you look at what people that have committed murder, or people in jail. So a friend of mine is a psychiatrist, and he has a whole bunch of transcriptions from conversations with convicted people, and they also say, before I knew it, I had this knife in the other guy, and later I super regretted that. So maybe if we think of all of this in terms of commitment, it might be that the pattern really is that you want to commit, and that's a short run thing, because that's when you can convince the other one that you're committed. But on the long run, reflection might make you commit a bit less to the behavior that you first really felt committed to. Okay, so if we go back to the question, why are we moral? We have to both look at the behavior, and we have to look at the comparison between us and other species. And our explanation is that it's not the case that we are playing the same games as other species, and that we just have different population structures or different repetition rates, but we play different games because of us being a technological and social species. And we have theory of mind. You need theory of mind to play those games at all. I mean, it helps to have theory of mind, but you also need theory of mind. So, the games that we play open a whole bunch of doors for opportunistic behavior. If we're going to build a boat together or invest in tools together, then that opens the door for opportunistic behavior. You might run off with my tools. You might slack. You might not work so hard for your part of the boat if you're making the sail, and that means that as soon as there is opportunistic behavior that can endanger our collective enterprise, there is space for commitment to not behaving altruistically to evolve. But for that, of course, you need to be able to put yourself in other people's shoes, because otherwise, however committed I am, you won't understand that I am. Well, in order to think about, what happens in the future if you're not committed, or if you are committed, you need to have capacity to do mental time travel. And in order to invest in anything, in any tool making, you need to have delayed gratification, but you also need to have delayed gratification if you play these games and think about giving up payoff now and getting more payoff in the future. So on 2 dimensions, commitment is actually a pretty good explanation, especially given that it's somewhat overlooked. One is the behavior itself. It matches better with the details of our deviations from simple selfishness. And also across species, it helps explaining why we are moral and other species with similar population structures and similar repetition rates aren't. I don't know how I'm doing on time, but maybe if I have some time left, it might be good to go back to our overview of mechanisms for the evolution of cooperation or altruism. So population structure is, of course, still there. It's its own category. Repetition is a mechanism. Now, commitment is a mechanism too. It can influence the behavior of existing partners, but it can also help you being chosen as a partner. And that means that within this mechanism, I've said a bunch of times, people need to know that you're committed, and therefore reputation can work here, or signaling may also play a role here. And the last thing is that there can also be costly signaling, as in sexual selection, where altruism can be a byproduct of costly signaling. So here it's a little murky what goes where, because signaling can also be part of commitment, and partner choice can be a part of commitment. But commitment doesn't need partner choice, and it doesn't need signaling if there's another way of making commitment common knowledge. And partner choice doesn't need commitment, for instance, when we're talking about sexual selection. So I would say human morality does not make sense except in the light of commitment. And there's a bunch of people with whom we're working on commitment. One is Asli, with whom I wrote this whole paper. There's a group with which we are working on commitment and honesty. There's a bunch of people with whom we're working on conditional cooperation and commitment. And there's a bunch of people with whom we did the angry button experiment with the Ultimatum Game. And I have no idea how I'm doing for time, but this is the end of my presentation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Matthijs. So it's 10 to 6 now, so we've got time for lots of questions, lots of stimulating points there, and a nice bit of controversy with the whole thing. So we can go to questions in the question and answer, and then if any of our panelists have questions, they can raise their hands.
If you want to stop your screen sharing.
Ah, sure. Yes.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
No, not at all.
It's a nice image, though. Love, peace, and understanding. We should have more of that. I'll go first to a question in the chat, which is it fair to say that if individuals can interact repeatedly, as you describe, and develop commitment, then individuals are not playing a simple one-shot ultimatum or trust game? So I guess the question is your setup.
Yeah.
What's really going on?
Yeah, that's a good question. So so one thing to keep apart is that if you can build a reputation for rejecting unfair offers in the ultimatum game, you don't have to build that reputation with one and the same opponent every time, right? So it's possible that you're really playing a series of one-shot games because you're playing it with one opponent, then with another one, and then with another one. So that makes it a non-repeated game, because with every one individual, you're just playing one iteration. And that sets it apart from repeated games. Yeah, I wouldn't say that these things never meet, right? So it can also be that if you are in a repeated interaction with someone, then maybe the first time you play, you're going to find out how committed this person is, and then the next time so in such a situation, it's a little bit. It would be harder to disentangle whether it's commitment or just regular repeated games.
Yeah, I guess, is there a connection to like models of indirect reciprocity and reputation formation?
There may be, but I haven't thought about that. So I have to think about this on the spot now. I'm not sure if I can say something.
Well, I'm just thinking, yeah.
So reputation, of course, is a big thing here, right? So what you need for commitment to work is that other people know that you're committed. And one possible pathway for other people to find out is reputation, right? So people can gossip about you, or maybe just observe your behavior with others directly. And this, of course, works also much better in humans where we do talk, right? We do gossip. So if you don't gossip, reputations don't spread as fast, right? Don't travel. Common knowledge doesn't travel as fast. With indirect reciprocity, so the theory models on indirect reciprocity, there may be models that I don't know. So one thing that we learned from writing this paper is how much we don't know, because every, after it was published, every few days we got a bunch of emails, you missed this paper, and then we did miss, my impression is that the theory on indirect reciprocity isn't great, right? It doesn't say, oh, we should expect indirect reciprocity all over the place. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the things that we would call indirect reciprocity in experiments would be an epiphenomenon of commitment and how we think about others that are committed to certain behaviors. That's possible. I'm not betting any money here, but I don't exclude that either.
Okay, cool. On a related point, we've got a question that asks, does a repeated interaction with one individual look exactly like playing randomly, but with the possibility of commitment within a reputation group?
Oh, this is difficult. Can you repeat the question?
You might be able to see it on, if you look at the Q&As. Can you see that? Sometimes easier to read.
Does a repeated interaction with one individual look exactly like playing randomly, but with the possibility of commitment within a reputation group? With playing randomly, if that means playing against a random opponent, with the possibility of commitment within a reputation. I think I would need more clarification to be able to answer that.
Yeah, there's a follow-up that says that's what I had in mind. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So playing with a random opponent.
Well, so if you play more than once with the same individual, then of course from your first interaction you get information, right, about your opponent. So I would say a repeated interaction with one individual isn't the same as a sequence of interactions with different randomly drawn individuals. So I see scope for differences there, but I'm not sure if I completely understand all the details of the question.
On a similar point, I was wondering whether the extent, when you had when you're talking about the responder and respondee, and one of the situations might be better for the respondee, but not so good for the responder. Are those results driven by, if you had kind of free choice, if you can choose anybody, would responders choose the respondees that will give them the best payoff? But if everything is, or if there's a constraint in which you can't choose, does that enable that commitment to work?
What we so what we try to do is just look at pathways, look at possibilities. So at some point during the presentation, I did contrast the Ultimatum game with the trust game. And in the trust game, on top of changing the behavior of your existing partner, partner choice could also be a force towards commitment. And it isn't in the Ultimatum game. So of course, it's an empirical question. How many situations we have fixed partners that we don't choose, or that maybe we have chosen in the past but we can't get rid of now, and how many situations we are free to go. It seems that even without partner choice, we have developed commitment to rejections in the ultimatum game. But you would think that in the trust game, also having partner choice puts the turbo on commitment there. Another detail, it's not really your question, but another thing here is that our evolution of cooperation literature is typically super rosy, right? It's nothing, or the worst that could happen is no cooperation, and then there's cooperation and altruism and happiness. But commitment not only explains, well, rejecting in the ultimatum game is not necessarily good, right? So there's a bunch of behaviors that, for instance, criminals commit to. Criminals also commit to rejecting your proposal by burning down your pizza place, right? While you're an earner of them, so they're burning your money and theirs. So that's super inefficient. There's no way in which that is a good norm. It's costly for them, but it helps you. It helps them making you pay, right? So commitment doesn't only produce rosy, happy, and good behavior, it also produces the darker sides of human behavior that are definitely there and aren't usually our favorite topic of research, but it's there, and it's, yeah.
Cool.
What should I do? Should I go to a next question, or
no? I'll yeah. We have Pete coming from the panel. That'd be good.
So, Matthijs, I'm sort of a fan of this distinction between proximate and ultimate causation. So your first two principles, reciprocity and kinship, basically, are ultimate explanations. So they're rooted in how selection would operate on a population. Things like commitment are proximal explanations. We have, as all of those lab experiments show, we do have a psychology that includes commitment, but that's a proximate explanation. All of the lab experiments, they can't test ultimate explanations. They're all experiments that highlight the proximal tools that we have to cooperate, and that other animals have to at least a lesser degree for the most part. So it seems to me that if we go back to that paper that you're fond of, what you missed in your explanation is, at least by Rob's and my account and other people who have the same idea, going back to Darwin himself, that what humans have is cultural relatedness, which is, in other words, there's much more population structure with regard to the culture than there is with regard to genes. So that little dot that you had just over the threshold, cultural kinship, so to speak, just pushes that way up and makes so that for the way I think about it, that's the ultimate mechanism that explains things like commitment. We can have commitment. Well, chimpanzees have commitment too, right? The dominant male in a chimpanzee group is committed to thrashing anybody who threatens his dominance, and so it's not that commitment is missing; it's that commitment is applied to a selfish, like your criminals running a protection racket. That's sort of what a dominance hierarchy is, right? Is a kind of a protection racket, and so it seems to me that you have to keep a distinction between these ultimate factors and proximate factors. That's a comment, not a question. I'm sorry.
So there's a bunch of interesting things to talk about. So the first is what is ultimate and what is proximate. So I think I would disagree that this is a proximate, because for it to be proximate, it would have to be some pathway to what really is an ultimate explanation. But for commitment, you don't need cultural relatedness. You don't need genetic relatedness. You don't need repetition. So if it's a proximate explanation, then it's not clear what it's proximate of, right? What is the ultimate thing there? So I would say that it is an ultimate explanation, and the proximate part would be our emotions that fire up, warm sentiments. If we imagine betraying someone's trust, or if we, if we anticipate, all kinds of opportunistic behavior. So.
But then how do we explain the difference between commitment in chimpanzees and commitment in humans? Commitment in humans is pro-social, and commitment in chimpanzees is antisocial. We both have commitment.
So I would say commitment in humans is across the board, right? It's both bad and good. And the difference between humans and chimps is that we are technological, and we operate that technology together. So that makes us play games that are different from the games that chimps play. And I should also say, of course, I don't want to be binary about the cross-species differences, right? I don't want to say, humans this and everyone else there, because what we would have to do is, humans here, chimps a bit closer, and then other things further away. So it's not binary humans against everything else, because it's also interesting to see that chimps commit more than zebras do, right? And chimps are also more technological than zebras are.
So your explanation essentially is that because of technology, there's a huge bonus to cooperation in humans that's missing in chimpanzees, say, or zebras.
Well, it's not just the size of the bonus to cooperation. It's the fact that we play games that take time, right? So we don't just play, you and I now cooperate defect and then the interaction is over. You and I play a game where I can build, stuff to hunt with that we later going to use together. Or I can, lots of things that we do are information intensive, technological, and they require planning. They require planning ahead. And for us to plan ahead together, we anticipate that if you're going to be opportunistic in the future, it's not worth making a plan together. And if you're not technological, and if you don't operate the technology together, you don't run into those problems. So it's not necessarily the size of the benefits to cooperation, but it's the fact that we plan. Our games have a time element in them, and there's future opportunistic behavior that we want to avoid today, right? So it's a different type of game. It's also the games.
Fair enough, but we pay a tremendous overhead for having the mental capacities to do these things. So we have this enormous brain that is metabolically and otherwise costly. So there must be corresponding benefits that we generate to pay the overhead for the big pumpkin.
Yeah. So I agree. So yes, there are benefits, and but I don't think that would be an argument against what I'm saying, right? So let me say that I want to be agnostic for now about the size of the benefits being an ingredient here. So what I can very well imagine is that the game has more, the games that humans play have more strategic complementarities, right? So everything falls apart if one with the weakest chain in some games, some games that we play, and that changes from, that makes it a prisoner's dilemma with unequal gains. That's also relevant. Yeah, well, you know, I only started thinking about this like a few years ago, and it seems to me that there's something there, right? So commitment, I think, really is a ultimate mechanism. It doesn't need any of the other things. So maybe I also want to answer your second question, and that is, so cultural group selection, out of all explanations, is the only one that says anything human specific, right? So in that sense, it has you know, it's 1 point ahead of everything else, because the other explanations, if you want to answer why us and not them, then you know, that's points for cultural group selection. So coincidentally, we also recently wrote a paper about what is called the cancellation effect at the group level. And the estimates of the cultural FST as an indicator of how favorable cultural group selection can be for the evolution of cooperation is actually optimistic. It's that there's a bias in those estimates because they assume that groups compete in a well-mixed population of groups. And there's actually also a cancellation effect at the group level that makes it a bit harder.
Yeah, I agree with that. Warfare, for example, is a cancellation effect at the group level, right?
Yeah. If everybody, well, yeah. So, you know, I don't know exactly what I have to do with what I should think of where cultural group selection stands. So that's interesting. But you know, another thing that I think our explanation has over cultural group selection is that in our setting, all of these things co-evolve together, right? Theory of mind, delayed gratification, mental time travel, and morality. You know, you get a bit better at theory of mind, you get a bit more moral, that works together. And many of the theory models for cultural group selection require that you first learn how to imitate without understanding complex behavior. And then through this payoff biased imitation, you build up a whole mechanism of morality without having a grammar to it, or without understanding why or what or how that works. And that sounds like an order of events that needs that I'm not 100% comfortable with. And the other thing is that many of those theory models in cultural group selection also use payoff biased imitation, and therefore they suffer from the problem that they assume that people don't understand the game and just try to get as much payoff as they can and just fail and you know, inadvertently become cooperators. And that's not what we see people do in the lab, right?
Okay, I think we're it's already 12 minutes past 6, and time is getting on, especially here in on this side of the pond. But apologies if we didn't get to your questions on the Q&A.
I'm sorry, there was someone with a bunch of questions.
Yeah. Those questions are there. You can, if you want to take a look. You can answer them in your own time.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much, Matthijs. Really great talk. I've got lots of my own questions as well, but maybe I'll put those in an email to you. Very provocative and fantastic. Thank you very much. And we hope the members of the audience are able to join us next week when we have a talk by Heidi Collerum. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks a lot, Matthijs. Really appreciate it. Thank
It's
you.
a pleasure.
Yes.